was one interesting example because it's kind of different to the Freedom of Information Act that it did engage the public. I was working in waste for a long time, and the council's Department of the Environment, they set up this hotline, public hotline, and you have people to ring in to report. It was kind of a consequence of the bin charges. They were seeing like people were dumping rubbish around the place. So they set up this hotline thinking, okay, we'll have this hotline for people to ring in if they see Maggie putting their rubbish in their bin that they can report them. But actually what they didn't anticipate was the hotline actually created a tidal wave of reports of illegal dumping on a much larger scale than just, a neighbour chucking some rubbish over the back fence. It actually started to reveal illegal landfills all over Wicklow, illegal landfills in the border regions. So many of the local governments were in chaos because they just thought this was just meant to be a little hotline for I saw somebody with a truck out to Dublin Mountains. And then it's created a tidal wave of crisis almost because we started to investigate these. I thought they were small farmer with putting a few bits of rubbish down the back paddock, and they realised these were huge operations that had been going over 30 plus years. Small restaurants holding in the Wicklow Mountains was probably one of the biggest examples, involving not just small farmers but involving big companies like Cement and Holdings. And it also revealed other failures of our planning system, which was a thing called retrospective planning permission, whereby somebody could do something, oops, sorry, I built that, oh well, here you go, here's your planning permission anyway, retrospectively. So that was happening a lot with the landfills, say, had illegal dumping sites. The government's reaction was, oh well, the rubbish is there anyway, here's your permit now to have an operating landfill. And it also was revealing things like when they actually went to investigate some of the sites, they realised that housing had actually, planning permission had actually been given on these areas that had operated as illegal landfills. And basically the farmer had used the waste to level their land, and then got the land rezoned by giving a few quid to Wicklow County Council and some of the Dublin councils to rezone the land for housing. So basically had a situation where people had bought houses on illegal landfills. So this was the consequence of just setting up a public hotline which was meant to just expose people who were actually breaking the legislation as a consequence of the bin charges. They thought they were actually going to enforce the bin charges and stop people just, little people just dumping here and there casually. And this was one of the consequences of this hotline, which created mayhem. The councils were, oh crap, what do we do now about this? So I think it's an interesting example of how the public can be engaged in other ways. And it also really can show the failure of our planning system, which I feel like to get out of corruption, our current government needs to address these loopholes that Fianna Fáil left in the planning and left in all those sorts of legislation that facilitated all this kind of corruption. And the governments don't seem to have a tendency to realise the need to tighten up this legislation as another way of countering corruption. And the legislation was written to facilitate corruption, call it what you want, to facilitate all this planning mayhem that was going on. And until that legislation gets rewritten in the interest of the public, not in the interest of developers, I think we're not going to fully ever get out of the rabbit hole, because the legislation was written to suit developers, not the public interest in the past in Ireland.
I think what you find is, and we've had more complaints about planning officials, appointed officials, than elected officials. The Man Tribunal found that elected officials, county councillors, were taking money in the past to have land rezoned or to influence the outcome of a rezoning decision. Appointed officials are responsible for planning, and we've seen more complaints about appointed officials than elected officials. The new lesson learned here is that corruption is displaced very often by legislation. It moves from one area to another. It'll always be around. People will always abuse power if they have the incentive and the opportunity to do it. It's like any crime, or the inclination to do it. And the challenge is to identify the incentives and close the opportunities for people to engage in abuses, whether you call it corruption or not. I often just refer to it as abuse or abuse of power, because you can't always readily identify the private gain, that quid pro quo in a corrupt transaction. And legislation can go so far to close these loopholes, but others will open. And it's largely about creating the right incentives for people and stopping or closing the opportunities for people to abuse their office.
Do you think?
Second question too was I was actually living in Australia for the last 4 years, and I was around when I don't know, call it what you will, Julia Gillard got Kevin Rudd got ousted, or call it what you will, replaced by Julia Gillard, and I just watched the Australian media, which is a fantastic example of ownership. Being, you know, we've got Fairfax Media owned by can't think of her name, the mining magnate anyway. She owns Fairfax Media. And then the Australian is basically backrolled by mining companies. So we've basically got two media outlets which are either owned directly by mining companies or backrolled by mining companies. And just watching the public, the onslaught through the private media of the mining tax that Kevin Rudd had proposed, and the consequences that ensued of Labour Party, you know, saying they've gotten rid of them or whatever, and then Julia Gillard being replaced and axing the mining tax altogether, softening it. So I don't know how you can kind of counter this, you know, the availability of the media we have, and companies to, I suppose, put as many ads as they like on TV. They can, you know, put a whole series on TV if they want to, paid by a mining company. We saw this with car manufacturers in the past, you know, sponsoring TV shows in America. So I don't know, how can we, even though this isn't corruption, it's lobbying in a different way that no amount of maybe legislation can prevent. And the consequence in Australia, for example, is huge. And seeing the current government now, which is spectacularly pro-mining, the Abbott government, and being around to watch all that happen as well. And you know, again, even with the best lobbying laws in the world, I don't know if you can come around these kind of problems and challenges.
I mean, one of the things that I mean, one change that I've seen, and it's very evident since I started working in this space, is the emergence of social media. There was no Twitter, there was no Facebook when I was starting out, and I trained in public relations, so everything went out through the newsrooms, in press releases. Now, I mean, you can see with in the wake of the referendum, how social media can be harnessed to complement, I wouldn't say necessarily replace the role of traditional media, to complement that and to counter narratives by traditional media. And we had a big job to do in countering narrative of some newspapers around the Garda whistleblowers. Those newspapers and the state broadcaster were being fed lines or lies by senior Gardaí about two whistleblowers. And we had to use traditional media as well as social media to get the word out about them and work with others in standing up for these two people. I don't think we're going to overcome the problems or issues surrounding media ownership anytime soon. I mean, the quickest way of counteracting that is through non-traditional forms of media communication. I think that's
the case of Australia was the TV, the ads were strongest on television, you know, and maybe it also shows, even though we have all the social media around, TV is still, I think, huge influencer. I just watched, like, literally you had the HB Belton and other mining companies every 15 minutes having ads on every private media channel in Australia, and that was just relentless, like 24/7. Every 15 minutes, basically telling us, the Australian public, that the mining tax was going to destroy the Australian economy, was going to make them all unemployed, and that was every 15 minutes. That was intense. So even for, you know, anyone who knows that all the arguments about the mining companies, even for you just to deal with that, I was almost starting to get run over, or not run over, but brainwashed, it felt like, by this onslaught. I was working in a place where the TV was on. I was working in a hotel at the time. The TV was just on all the time. So, and you know, people were just being swayed left, right, and centre by this onslaught on the TV. And I don't know, even with all the best social media in the world, it just couldn't buffer.
We don't have that problem to the same extent in Ireland. The Broadcasting Act outlaws political advertising here. I mean, we would never get an ad on radio or TV to promote anti-corruption, you know. So you can't do this. You can't engage in the same kind of lobbying using TV or radio that you can in the US or in Australia or elsewhere. So in some respects, we're very lucky. Just knowing my Russian colleagues are under enormous pressure now, with Putin having introduced a new law that will potentially outlaw Transparency International and Amnesty International in Russia. Up until now they've had to brand themselves foreign agents, Russian, that's translated as a spy. You have to put that on your website because they're receiving foreign funding. So we're working in a more enabling environment here than we might sometimes give ourselves credit for. There's an opportunity there for us to reach out to people that others don't have. And in spite of all the problems we have with media ownership as well, there are still outlets that we can use. And non-traditional, it's like the journal or broadsheet and others that are interested in pursuing these kind of stories.
I think it is quite interesting though the way you're speaking of, because it's essentially, you were talking about abuse of power and how that kind of factors in, and it's essentially trying to get the turkeys to vote for Christmas kind of thing. You're essentially asking the people who are the most susceptible or most prone to corruption to actually vote to cancel corruption. And you were saying how corruption can move quite a bit and it's quite translucent, it'll go from one side to the other depending on how the legislation changes. But it's interesting though, because I'd be quite interested to hear what you guys think of what role, I mean it was kind of alluded to in a lot of questions that came forward in what role citizens have to play, because this whole notion that, you know, we elect our politicians, they'll act in our best interest, they'll only do what's right for us and then they'll move on. I think one of the main components of Anti-Corruption International, I alluded to in the speech, was about empowerment. I think it's about empowering people to start questioning these, empowering people to start seeing that you don't just elect a politician, he'll solve all the corruption problems and then you move on. And another thing was what Ed Chris was talking about, he says about our role here will also be to assist and to kind of facilitate development in other regions, like in, say, for example, Uganda or the Philippines, where within a couple of weeks we had people writing to us saying, you know, what level of protection can you offer us? You know, we could be in some serious trouble here, and if we pop our heads too high with the parapet, you know, and there's that kind of thing. So I think it's quite interesting. I'd be interested to hear what opinions you have on how to empower citizens to deliver change. I think that would maybe be more relevant to our work than